day after. All right, so part 2 of the church and politics brings us to the history of the church and power. So last week we looked at a significant number, not by any means all, but a significant number of examples from the scriptures outlining what the kingdom of God is, what it's supposed to do, how it's supposed to do it, what its goals are, all of that. And there is, of course, an obvious contrast between that and the goals and methods and procedures of whether 15th century England or ancient Byzantium or America today. We saw that contrast. We ended by the comparison of apples to oranges. That whatever nation on earth we're talking about is an apple. Some are good, some are bad. Some are sweet, some are tart, some are rotten, but none of them are an orange. And we talked about that. We finished with that thought. I want to now dip into history. And today we're going to spend some time looking at some fairly old examples in church history in the very early church, and then some quite recently. We'll actually have a couple of examples from American history. Next week we'll look at a couple of examples from our modern discussion, things that we're talking about today, and see how this fits within that framework. So let's start with Pastor Boyd's summation, as it were, of church history. He says this: tragically, the history of the church has been largely a history of believers refusing to trust the way of the crucified Nazarene, and instead giving in to the very temptation he resisted. So we started with that thought, with the temptation of Jesus, right? So he says church history has largely been us saying, we're not a fan of the way you did it, Jesus. That won't work for us. And instead saying, no, we want that power that Satan offered. That's what we want. That's his summation of church history. We'll see examples tonight. It's the history of an institution that's frequently traded its holy mission for what it thought was a good mission. And may have been a good mission, may have been a useful purpose, may have been something decent, but it wasn't the mission of the church. Wasn't what the church was called to do, not the way the church was called to do it, and that's, of course, where we get into the problem. It's the history of an organization that's frequently forsaken the slow, discreet, nonviolent, sacrificial way of transforming the world for the immediate, obvious, practical, less costly way of improving the world. And I'm all for improving the world. Right? I'm all for education and advances in medicine and agriculture and all of that to make people's lives better, to cut down on suffering. I'm all for that. But that's not the primary mission of the church. That's not what we are called to do per se, and certainly not by the methods that have often been, the church has often tried. But notice the difference between transforming the world and improving the world. Again, we said that about Jesus. Had he taken Satan up on his offer, he would have made the greatest kingdom the world has ever known. And it would have been far superior, anything any human could have done. No matter what form of government, no matter who was in charge of it, no matter what laws were passed, Jesus would have been better at it. But it would have only been an improvement, not a transformation. So let's dive into the history. And if we're going to talk about the history of the church and power, we got to go all the way back to Constantine. Emperor Constantine, that's where it all starts. Constantine, by his own testimony, had a vision, had a dream before a very significant battle in his life in Roman history, where he saw a cross in the sky and was told to conquer by this sign, in this name, so to speak, conquer. But of course, that is not what Jesus said in Matthew 26:52. Put your sword back in its place, Jesus said to him, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. What Constantine did after that battle was resolve a Roman civil war. And one of the reasons why Rome falls is because of the constant and consistent civil wars. The power struggles again and again and again, sapping the strength of the empire. This is just one of those. But Constantine, because he won the subsequent battle, became emperor, decided that God was on his side, that the God of represented by Jesus, of these Christians, which at that time, of course, were still a minority within the empire and a persecuted one. And that persecution, of course, ranges from severe to minor, and it's very localized. That's a whole different part of church history. But he decided that God was on his side because he had the vision, and then he won. Made sense to him. So as emperor, he said, well, if that God is with me, I'll be with him. We're on a team. All right, a very transactional relationship, and not one unlike a number of other rulers in history, especially ancient history, have claimed for themselves to be tapping into the divine, to have God or the gods on their side. Now, from all we can tell, Constantine's personal conversion, his faith in Christ, was legitimate. He was baptized before his death. His faith seemed to be sincere, at least in the long run. But the question, of course, remains, is there any basis for concluding that God made a pact with him? That God made a pact with any secular authority in the New Covenant? Now, we know God did in the Old Covenant, very specifically with Israel, and with the Davidic line in particular, right? Very clear promises. This land will be yours. These blessings will be yours. Of course, the part that the Old Testament reminds us of is that there are curses that go with it when they didn't follow the law. But there was a very specific pact, agreement, much like an emperor would have with his subjects. The fancy term is suzerainty, that God was the emperor and Israel was the subject people. And as long as they obeyed, he would give them his benevolence. But do we see that in the New Covenant? When we flip to the New Testament, we read the Gospels, we read the book of Acts, we read the writing of Paul, do we see that same thing outlined anywhere with any people, or hinted that someday it would be? Now the answer is no. There's no New Testament text of Scripture, and no prophecy from the Old Testament that points to it either, that says that Jesus intended, or that the Holy Spirit was supposed to empower the church to fulfill its mission through coercion and violence. Right? What does Jesus tell his disciples? Go into the world and preach the gospel. Go to the ends of the earth. Share this message with everyone. And the book of Acts, we see them learning, first with the Samaritans and then with the Gentiles, that yes, this really is supposed to be for everybody. First Peter and then with Paul. And the book of Acts shows us that transition to a global mission. But nowhere in any of that is the church's work accomplished with force, with bribes, with coercion, with threats, with violence of any kind. And that is, of course, the standard for the first 3 centuries of the church, in part because they had no power. We don't know what they would have done with it. Would they have done well with it? Would they have shunned it and not used it against their enemies? We don't know, because they didn't have it. But they would get it because of Constantine. And St. Augustine is actually the first example of that. He approved of the use of force, the use of the military, to force the Donatists to end their schism. The Donatists were a group that disagreed with Augustine in North Africa about the ecclesiology of the North African church. Long story short, and if you want to know more about this, and several of the other episodes, my seminar on church history goes into much greater detail on some of these. We're just focusing on the angle of power here. Just after Constantine makes Christianity legal, Augustine is asking him to send the army to North Africa. Well, there was an army, to use the army in North Africa to force the Donatists to stop arguing with them. Literally, only a couple years after force was available, it was being used Christian on Christian violence. It's one of our first examples of that, our first concrete example of Christians saying, since you don't agree with me, or some variation thereof. Interesting sound effect I came up with there. That feud in North Africa predated Constantine. It started during the Great Persecution when many in North Africa abandoned their faith because they were told, keep your faith or go to jail and possibly be tortured and murdered, which pick one. And many of them said, well, I'd rather not die, and they walked away from it. When that persecution ended, several years later, they wanted to go back to church. as it were, to rejoin the community. And the Donatists are the group that, after the bishop that they supported, said, you're not coming back. You're apostates. You failed the test. We don't want you. And Augustine said, no, that's not the way this works. We're about grace. They're allowed to be forgiven. And they were arguing about it. It's a very interesting theological question, but they could not get along about that. And for generations, they had been fighting about that, and they will continue to fight about it until the day Islamic armies, 4 centuries later, conquer North Africa. They never stopped fighting about it. So, all right, that's a fight, more than 4 centuries worth. The use of the military to force them back in didn't work. Now, we don't know if anything would have worked, right? If you're going to keep a fight going for more than 4 centuries, you're really invested in it. Maybe we can't solve it. But using the military didn't work. They were obstinate, right? Now, these were the people that believed if someone threatens your life because of your faith, you have to stand up to them. So they weren't going to back down when the military said, drag you in here and sit down with them and behave yourself. So, yeah, they didn't. Where does this idea come from? You might have never guessed where Augustine got this idea from. What was his scriptural basis? The parable of the great banquet. Luke 14:23, not one of Jesus' most well-known parables. But at the end of the parable, the text says, then the master told his servant, go out to the roads and country lanes and compel them to come in so that my house will be full. So at the end of the parable, right, which of course, anytime you take a parable and turn it into action, you got to be careful because it is a parable. But Augustine said, there is an example of force being used to compel them to come in, so I can do it too. Now, the fascinating thing is that there is only one person more influential in church history than St. Augustine. That's my statement, but a lot of historians would say the same thing, and that's the Apostle Paul. If you line them up, Augustine is almost definitely second. And yet, despite all of his great theology, despite the city of God and all of the things that he wrote and his huge lasting influence, this is a weak scriptural basis for the use of the military against fellow Christians. If God was going to authorize that, don't you think he would have made it a little more clear? Maybe Paul would have talked about it. Maybe it would have been in the book of James. Maybe it would have been somewhere else than just one parable where you're taking a parable and turning it into government policy. But he thought it was a noble end. And it is. Church unity, right? Church unity is a noble goal. But if you achieve it through an ignoble means, how can you be doing the will of God? Because God is not tempted by evil. God does not use evil to make good results. So therefore, God did not intend you to use evil to make something noble happen. God doesn't do that. If you think God is, then you don't understand God. Or the will of God, apparently. You either don't understand his character or what he's trying to accomplish because you think God wants to use evil. So there's early church example, right? As soon as power was available, somebody said, I got a use for that. I could put that to use and fix a problem we got right here. But it didn't work. What about some people that went in an opposite direction? One of the largest influences on the medieval church is monasticism. It gained speed and breadth and was everywhere during the Middle Ages. You know about monks and nuns. You know the basic understanding of what they were doing. They basically said, we're going to partially withdraw from society. They didn't totally withdraw. They still interacted, did commerce with people. They still were, in some cases, involved in their communities. But they said, we're going to more or less withdraw as best we can and focus on worship and service. And so the question is, was that a step in the right direction? Now, on one level, whatever it might be, it's not a solution for everybody, right? For the celibacy, for one thing, because you're not going to have another generation of the church if nobody gets married and nobody has kids, right? That we're kind of self-limiting there. But what were they able to accomplish? That's an interesting question. If you look at it, some amazing things. Founding of hospitals, schools,
Much of the learning of the Middle Ages and High Middle Ages was at the behest of monks. And nunneries for girls, of the nobility in particular, but massively important in the preservation of biblical manuscripts. Most of the copies of the original manuscripts that we have today were copied by people in monastic communities, especially as time goes on, because they're the ones that had the time to do it. And, of course, evangelism. Some of the great evangelists were monks. How did they manage that then? I think one of the things that would be an answer is that they took vows of poverty, vows of chastity, and vows of obedience. And I think those held in check that human nature, that fallen human nature's impulse that the nobility was all trying to get with both hands. And far too often the church's normal leadership was as well, that striving for money and power and sex. And all of the evil that gets caused by that, all of the greed, all of the pride. That much of that gets set aside when you're not trying to pass anything on to the next generation, right, to your son or whatever, because you don't have one. When you're not having dynastic feuds, when you're not doing any of that stuff, when you don't own anything, right? What's the point of greed when you're not allowed to own anything? It takes a little of the sting out of that. So they definitely had something right. It wasn't a solution for everybody, but they found something interesting. And that was a kingdom of God emphasis and a disdain for the kingdoms of the world. They were basically saying, we're going to do our thing, you do your thing. Look at their daily routine. I put this in here in part just because it's impressive. All right, the daily routine of worship and prayer, not all of them did exactly this, but they have what they call the Liturgy of Hours or the Divine Office 7 times each day and once at night. And look at the times and you'll see that these are not convenient. They would gather together for the monks or the nuns, or sometimes both together if they had a shared community, for prayers, hymns, and readings. It wasn't a long service, but they basically had a church service 8 times every day. 2 a.m., which is great, because you just fell asleep, right? 5 a.m., you just got back to sleep from the 2 a.m. service, and now you're back up. And then, of course, 6 a.m., don't even bother going back to sleep. And then 9, 12, 3, 6, and then at sundown, more or less 7, depends on where you are in the calendar. You got all that going on? You don't have time to be worried about things like power and how to use it. Not that there were not some that got sucked into that, but by and large, they found a way around it. Now again, it's not a solution for everybody, but there might be some lessons from that. That they were so focused on the kingdom of God, on scholarship, on charity, on healing, on science, that they just kind of said, we've got more important things to do. Well, what was the Middle Ages like? In the West, and by West we mean the Roman Empire and the kingdoms left after its collapse, Rome falls. And what's left are a bunch of barbarian kingdoms, the Visigoths and the Vandals and all of those guys, vying for power and control of the various territories. But they realized that the Romans actually had a system. And when we destroyed Rome, the system kind of fell apart. Law and commerce and all of that. And the only people that really understood the system and could administer it well were the bishops. They were some of the most highly educated people in the new kingdoms. They knew Roman law. They knew what to do. And so they became counselors. They became indispensable people to these, in the Roman eyes, upstart kingdoms, rulers. So in the West, because of that dynamic, because of how impactful they were early on, we're going to have about 1,000 years but where the nobility, the aristocracy, kings, dukes, earls, all that mumbo jumbo, are fighting with the church, bishops and cardinals and popes, over who is supposed to be in charge. Because it's not a settled question.
And it will be inconclusive the whole time. Every once in a while, the church will gain the upper hand, and then a particular king will gain the upper hand. Neither side can put the other one firmly under its foot. So they're continuing to fight. They use excommunications, the popes sometimes do. They get in the middle of dynastic feuds about who the next king is going to be. They get involved in that. And of course, warfare. Literal warfare between France, the Kingdom of France, or the Duchy of Milan, or whatever, and the church in the form of the Papal States. And you might be thinking, the Papal States? What are the Papal States? I'm glad you asked. The Papal States were created in 754, so not that far after the fall of Rome, and it made the church a country. A small one, but a country. And so from that point on until 1870 at the bottom of the page, so for 1,100 years, the church in the West, being run out of Rome, has split motives because it has territorial ambitions, because it has alliances and rivalries in Italy. And the history of Italian politics from the fall of Rome until the unification of the country is a interesting subject. There is all sorts of stuff going on there, and with the feuds and the families, it's a mess. And they get right in the middle of that. It came about because Rome, the city of Rome, was once part of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire is the eastern half of Rome. And after Rome fell, the Roman Empire in the west, the Byzantines filled that vacuum for a little while and controlled much of Italy, but they eventually lost it to one of the barbarian kingdoms. Of course, they're the ones calling them barbarians. And when it was reconquered by the Frankish king, in other words, the French king, a man named Pepin, he gave the land that he had reconquered to the Pope, instead of giving it back to the emperor in Byzantium, in Constantinople. He did that because that was his rival. He was a rival, King Pepin, to the Byzantine emperor. And so he didn't want to help out his rival, so he put that land under the control of the papacy and said, this will be a good buffer. This will work for me. It was actually not too shabby on his part, but it gave the church all sorts of trouble. And of course, one of the other things that gets involved in all of this for this 1,000-year period from the fall of Rome until really the Reformation is the Holy Roman Emperor. When Charlemagne is crowned the Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III. And of course, that is an interesting question. Who has the right to crown an emperor? Does the Pope have that authority or not? That was a mixed bag for the church in terms of its power fight, because not only did Pope Leo crown him, which you would think, I have the upper hand, but then he knelt to him and did obeisance to him and said, you're the emperor. They regretted that afterwards. They wanted the one but not the other. And so that fight will go on and on and on until 1870. Anyone guess? Well, I'll leave it alone. Other stuff. I could delve into these. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the 30 Years' War. I take them as a whole. Each of those is a huge topic all by itself. But remember the chant, the mantra of the Crusades. God wills it. That's what they yelled as they went into battle, as they slaughtered the inhabitants of Jerusalem. When they retook Jerusalem, there are tales of the blood running as high as the bridles of the horses kind of thing. They slaughtered all the Muslims. They slaughtered all the Jews, which were the vast majority of the inhabitants of the city. It was epic. And that was the kind of thing that was said, and many other things were spoken as being God's will and God's plan in order to justify torture and murder. God wanted it to happen, is what they believed. Not only said it, but they believed it. Throughout this whole time period, and up and through the 30 Years' War and beyond, we have at the same time an existential threat on the southern and eastern borders of Christendom in Islam. You probably know it primarily through the Ottoman Empire that will last until the end of World War I. But Islam is expansive during this time period, right? They move up and conquer Spain. They go in all the way into France, famously fighting there as well. And then they start to get pushed back there, but they're fighting in the Balkans, they're fighting in the Mediterranean, and Christendom is not unified. Christian leaders are not unified. They're more interested, as the King of France or Burgundy or wherever, or Naples, of fighting amongst themselves over their own inheritances and their own dynastic feuds and their own hatreds than they are protecting their people and their co-religionists from an existential threat. And so that fight persists for 1,000 years, largely because of this ongoing use of warfare for the purposes of power and wealth and everything else, that the church is not able to stop, and sometimes not interested in stopping, and sometimes part of making it worse. And so you have a significant issue there. And of course, throughout this period, we see forced conversions, especially with the reconquest of Spain. Whether you were a Jew or a Muslim, when Ferdinand and Isabella and the rest reconquered Spain, it was a very simple question. You want to convert? You want to die? You make a pick, right? Conversion or death? Conversion or death? Pick one. And of course, for generations afterwards, they didn't trust that the conversions made with a sword to their throat were genuine, and so the descendants of those people were treated as second-class citizens. I wonder why they didn't trust that those conversions were genuine, right? And of course, some people were tortured in that direction. What do you mean you don't believe in the Trinity? Let me torture you for a while and see if we can turn you around on that. And of course, throughout this whole time period, we have a persistent pattern of killing people that are labeled heretics. Some of them were, in an Orthodox sense, heretics and deniers of the faith, and some of them were just people that disagreed about this issue or that issue and got labeled a heretic, and then it's all over. Men like Jan Hus, the Bohemian nationalist, whose crime was that he wanted the common people to be able to take communion in both kinds, both the bread and the wine. Because at that time period, they were not normally able to. Only the nobility, like the duke, would take it for you, because he's the head of your lord and master and whatnot, and so you don't really need it. And he's like, that's not going to work for us. This is the body of Christ. He's theologically right, but he got himself burned at the stake for opposing the hierarchy. This happens in large numbers. And so from the fall of Rome through the Reformation and a little bit beyond, we see the church going from being the martyrs to the martyrers, to the martyrs, the ones that are doing the martyring, instead of the ones being martyred. Something's not right, right? Something, as Shakespeare said, something's rotten in the state of Denmark. Something is not right here when that is happening. And once the Reformation rolls around, we see theological disputes, arguments primarily over communion, over the Eucharist. What does it mean exactly? The difference between transubstantiation and consubstantiation. People were murdering each other, burning whole towns to the ground, and watching people die over those arguments. And there was a level of barbarity in the 30 Years' War rarely seen in world history. It was beyond disturbing. And most Christians and most Americans and Europeans don't even know what the 30 Years' War was, other than the fact that you guess that it lasted about 30 years. Like the War of 1812 has a dead giveaway in it. The 30 Years' War, like the 100 Years' War, which was longer than the 30 Years' War, you know that about it. But what else, right? You don't know about how much Christian-on-Christian violence there was during that war. Catholics against Lutherans, Lutherans against Reformed, Reformed against Lutheran, Reformed against Catholic, and everybody against the Anabaptists, as I like to explain it in my church history seminar.
That was the only thing they could agree on, is that they were all willing to torture and murder Anabaptists. So, it's nice to be loved. So what does Pastor Boyd say about this? What's his summary about this? What did the church do once it had power, right? Once, from Constantine on, the reigning church as a whole, what we normally call Christendom, acted about as badly as the most versions of the kingdom of the world. Look at history from the fall of Rome through the end of the Reformation period. Are those kingdoms acting any better than the Muslim kingdoms, than the Chinese kingdoms, than the African kingdoms, anybody else's kingdoms? Not much. You see this rape, torture, murder, war. You see it everywhere. Throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, millions. Now, I question he didn't provide a stat, because obviously we have no idea how many people. It was a lot. Maybe it was only hundreds of thousands, but does that really matter? Were burned at the stake, hung, beheaded, or executed in other ways for resisting some of the church's teaching or for failing to operate under its authority. Thousands upon thousands were tortured in unthinkable ways in an attempt to elicit a confession of faith in the Savior and the church. Again, what is the value of that? Is that really what someone's going to stand before God one day and say, I was proud that I burned people with a hot iron so that they would confess Christ? That's not going to go well, right? God's thinking, what an idiot. I don't know if God says what an idiot, but I think in this case. So long as they remained a persecuted minority, here's the interesting part of this. Reformers, the Lutherans and the Reformed, generally decried the use of violence for religious purposes, said, don't do that. That's not fair. But once given the power of the sword, most used it as relentlessly as it had previously been used against them. They were not against the use of force against religious minorities until they were the religious majority and had the chance to do it to other religious minorities, because the shoe was on the other foot. It wasn't until the bloodshed became economically unbearable and unfeasible in the 30 Years' War that a truce, known as the Peace of Westphalia, was called, and Christians agreed, at least theoretically, to end the violence. The 30 Years' War ended because of exhaustion. Whole areas, whole regions were decimated. In some places, 75% of the population had been killed or fled. There were areas that went back to being forest because all the villages had been burned and there was nobody left. The nations exhausted themselves. France, the German states, the Swedes were involved. All sorts of, it went back and forth, shifting alliances. And much of it had less to do with religion than it did, of course, with the King of France saying, I got an opportunity here to conquer a little bit of territory I've had my eye on, and so I'm going to jump in on this. Reading about the 30 Years' War is enough to make one cynical, and for good cause. Not a good example of the church having power and doing something with it. So I've not encouraged you at all with this history. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the 30 Years' War. But I unfortunately have to go to one more base. We've got to bring it home with the last example, which is the worst. Anti-Semitism and the road that led to the Holocaust. And you might be thinking, what does the church's argument with and thoughts about power have to do with the Holocaust? And the answer is unfortunately far too much. Because the story begins with the Crusades. You might not know that. The road that led to Auschwitz began with the First Crusade. Because the Crusades was the first time that there was widespread, purposeful slaughter of Jews by Christians, because they were Jews. Now, of course, you could find an example here or there of anti-Semitism, one outbreak, one riot, but this was on the way to Crusade. In Germany, a population of Jews was slaughtered. They were ahead of the game there.
but of course in Jerusalem as well. And it picked up after that with the reconquest in Spain. That's where it started. Did the church push back against that? Not nearly enough. Because often enough, those leading the call for anti-Semitism, those saying they're the ones that murdered Jesus, those saying kill them, were priests or bishops even. We all know that in his old age, Martin Luther fell prey to anti-Semitism. This was not an isolated idea, but it grew out of the Crusades, out of the idea that we could purify a population, a region, a nation with the sword and reclaim it for God. Again, none of this has scriptural basis in the New Covenant. Now, some of these people are reading Old Covenant stuff into this and saying, well, they're just like the Canaanites, and therefore, or like Sodom and Gomorrah, and therefore we're exercising God's judgment. But that's your prerogative, not God's. It's a vast difference between God says do such and such, and we do it, and you saying, I think God thinks such and such, let's do it. What would the church have done if it was acting as the kingdom of God when the Holocaust started? Not what it did. It would have stood with the persecuted. It would have offered sanctuary. It would have worked to undermine the Nazis and the SS and the Gestapo, denouncing what was done to them as evil. Did some do that? Yeah. Some of them ended up in the concentration camps themselves. Some of them ended up murdered. But by and large, no. Far fewer voices were crying out in defense of the minorities in their midst, not just Jews, also Jehovah's Witnesses and others. And far more were saying, it's about time, get them. Right? When they went into Poland, who showed them which houses were the ones owned by Jews? Their Polish neighbors. Who betrayed Anne Frank? One of her neighbors. This is not the part of history that we like to talk about or think about. But the church's role in the Holocaust is not deniable. It's not forgivable in that sense. It is the greatest stain in church history. And one that the church has much left to do to atone for, if that's even possible. So let's pause for a minute. Because we're going to take a look at some different examples. What jumps out at you? Any questions, any thoughts when we start looking at these broad sweeps of history and what the church's role was?
Do you mean to deliberately discourage all of us from ever being a Christian?
Nope. No, I do not. And that's an excellent question, but the question was, am I trying to discourage people from being Christians? No, I'm trying to discourage people from believing Christianity based on inaccurate information. I know, it's tongue-in-cheek. But seriously, if we can't face it, because this knowledge is out there. Agnostics, atheists, Muslims, Hindus that you might witness to or speak to, they know this. Go to if you were in a Muslim nation or in a Muslim community in America or in France or somewhere, and you started talking to people, it would not be long before they brought up the Crusades. They still talk about the Crusades. Now, to us, we're like, we have a hard time talking about history more than 20 years ago, right? Our eyes glaze over. Americans, we don't pay attention to history. We don't. Our knowledge is woeful, but they still talk about it. It's still to them a watershed moment. All right. And you explaining them that the fighting went both ways and that the barbarity went both ways is really not going to fix the issue either. Right? Because if our best response is, well, we're not any worse than you are, what's the evangelism angle there? What are you explaining about the power of God and the transformation of the Holy Spirit if you're saying, well, we are not any worse than you are? You know, it's like two little kids saying, he hit me first. Come on. Here's one that you might not
you won't remember per se, but one you might not have thought of as being part of this discussion, and it's prohibition. Prohibition is the pinnacle of white Protestant power in America, basically making an amendment to the Constitution, all right, and getting it passed. That is saying we got some juice here. We got some power. 1920 to 1933 are the years that it was in effect. Ed Dobson, Pastor Dobson, wrote, perhaps the most instructive example of how well-intentioned efforts of Christians to correct a horrible problem failed to bring about the desired results is the attempt to ban alcohol at the beginning of the 20th century. And we'll come back around to that at the end. He has another comment about that. It took about 100 years, more or less, for this to get to this moment when it was illegal. There were temperance movements, especially ladies' societies, trying to get alcohol curbed or limited or banned for generations. In the 1890s, they had what was called the Anti-Saloon League, which sounds interesting. And their motto was, the church in action against the saloon. Church against the bars, let's rumble, right? And it's not a softball league. This was like a real thing. The passage of the 18th Amendment demonstrated the power that they had. Protestant churches in America at that time had a lot of political power. But it created a backlash. And we'll talk about Oliver Cromwell and the Commonwealth in a bit. That's a later example. But remember this, because this is the same issue. On January 16th, 1920, the 18th Amendment went into effect. Prohibition began, and America became a dry nation by law, but not for long. Initially, making alcohol illegal seemed to work. Prohibition brought the lowest level of alcoholic consumption per capita in American history in 1921. 1921 was the year in American history where people drank the least amount of alcohol per person. And you're thinking, well, then we won, right? We saw a problem, we passed a law, it dropped, boom. But consumption rose as bootleggers and rum runners became better organized. By 1927, 21 to 27, 6 years later, consumption was back to the level of the late 19th century. It didn't work. And of course, there was a downside that you are familiar with. Since the passage of the 18th Amendment, drinking had increased. Bootlegging and official corruption were widespread. And judicial and penal systems were overburdened by prosecutions. States were slackening their efforts at enforcement, and respect for the law was being eroded by prohibition. Right? That's the era of these criminals that are still romanticized to this day, with their Tommy guns and their fast, souped-up Fords. And where did they get that power from? Where did they get that money from? Illegal alcohol sales. And so Dobson's conclusion, when you attempt to change a social problem exclusively through the legislature, it's only a matter of time until opposition line up enough votes to undo your agenda. What began as a noble attempt to correct a tragic alcohol problem in American society, ended in a defeat that made religious people look like a band of moralizing killjoys. You are the ones that want to ruin all our fun. And at the turn of the century, alcoholism was a very significant problem in America. Higher than it is today. Of course, today we've got other things that spread some of that dysfunction around. But it was a major problem. And it was and curbing it, lowering alcoholism, was a noble goal. It didn't work. And so he says, yes, alcohol abuse has ruined lives, has torn families apart, has led to physical and emotional abuse of women and children. How many churches in our county have AA meeting there? This one does, and a bunch of other ones. We get that. Has caused the death of thousands at the hands of drunk drivers all the time. But I don't think we can solve this problem by passing more laws. I've thought a lot about prohibition because it's so tempting to try to save America through the political process. We'll talk about the moral majority later. Ed Dobson knows what he's speaking of. He has firsthand experience in this effort. And he says, it just is so tempting. You love the country, you want to fix the problem, and you think, hey, well, let's pass a law. It'll fix it. The crusade for prohibition involved thousands of good people who sincerely wanted to eradicate the source of much pain in society. Nobody doubts their motives. Nobody doubts their hearts. Nobody doubts their passion for the gospel. But their solution to that particular problem backfired and blew up in their faces. So according to Dobson, where did they go wrong? Well, one thing he thinks they did wrong was that the leaders of the temperance movement expected the government to do the work of the church. And that is a perennial question. What is the church's responsibility? What is the government's responsibility when it comes to social ills? Right? We have this conversation all the time about all manner of social ills, from divorce to abortion to all sorts of other ones. What is the church's role? What is the government's role? That's a perennial question, not one we can easily solve, nor even have to have the same answers to. But in this case, they clearly seem to have gone over the line. Secondly, the leaders of the temperance movement failed in trickle-down morality. You get where he got that from, right? He was a product of the 80s. He remembers the economic theory about that. But he said it didn't work with morality, that you can impose it here and it'll get down to the people that need it. And then this thought: morality is never activated from the top down. It's achieved from the bottom up, one person at a time, one family at a time, one street at a time, one community at a time, until the entire culture is changed, not by laws, but heart by heart. Now, I'd say that there is, and Dobson would have agreed, an exception to this rule, of course, when you're talking about protecting the innocent and those that are being maligned and whatnot. We don't necessarily have to have consensus and convince the child molesters, right, to stop doing that. We can pass laws to say this is illegal and we're going to throw you in jail, that kind of thing. He's talking about this kind of social issue. Thirdly, he said, respect for law is based on moral consensus. This is an important point. More so than in America than in many nations, but it's true everywhere. Legislation must reflect the consensus of the people governed, or they'll just disregard the law. If we were to succeed today, and here's where he may upset some people, and I'm quoting him, so I hope I don't upset some people, but I think this is a hard truth we need to pay attention to. If we were to succeed today in passing a law that would ban nearly all abortions, it's unlikely that it would be effective. Why? Because it doesn't reflect the moral consensus on the issue. America is still deeply divided. If you look at the polls, about 50% either way. If the Supreme Court, and there's a strong likelihood that a case will be decided in the near future, if the Supreme Court kicks it back to the states, abortion will be illegal in about half the states within a matter of days. And legal in the other ones, legal, half and half. The number won't change that much, because they were happening before it was legal, as we know, because a lot of people want to have that. And a lot of people wanted to drink alcohol when Prohibition was passed. The most effective laws follow moral consensus. They don't bring about moral consensus. Our task as believers and followers of Jesus is to continue the tedious work of moral transformation of culture. I think one of the greatest examples of that is the life of William Wilberforce. If you ever get a chance to study the life of William Wilberforce, do it. Spent decades fighting for the outlawing of slavery in the British Empire. Finally had victory in that issue just before his death. People mocked him, people laughed at him, and the fascinating thing about his story, and I didn't include it in this thing because I already had 200 slides, or 133 slides, I had to draw the line somewhere, is that he worked with people that would normally not be on his team. He worked with people that didn't even necessarily believe in God, but they agreed with him on slavery. He was a radical in that sense. He said, I'll take anybody who wants to end slavery and we'll work together. We'll pass out pamphlets together. It was a fascinating kind of thing. He's a hero. He's a good man. And then 4, let the church be the church. Christians in the temperance movements had the ultimate answer, but surrendered it for a lesser answer that turned out to be no answer at all. They exchanged the gospel for political solutions and in the end lost on both accounts. Ed Dobson is saying that the people behind the temperance movement had the answer to alcoholism and other social ills all along. They didn't need to go searching for the answer, they had the answer. But because they tried to find a different answer, they discredited their answer. So that for a generation or more, people thought the church is where fun goes to die, right? If you are a person that enjoys life, don't go to church. Is that not still some people's opinion? Right? You can admit it, it's okay. We try to get down and get fun now. We try to have fun, enjoy ourselves on Sunday, but I get that. So what about these guys? Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority, you remember them? That's a picture from there about 1980. Jerry was a newcomer to the political arena. For years, he had preached against such involvement, but then he had a change of heart. He announced his intentions to get involved in politics in order to reverse the moral decline in American culture. Watching the 60s, the 70s, Jerry Falwell said, all right, I'm getting involved. But notice that his focus was on American culture and that he believed that you could change the culture at the ballot box. And that is a fascinating theory, that you can change the culture by law. That's an interesting premise. So how did they do? Time magazine, man, got on the cover. We made our mark. We influenced an entire election. Our agenda would never again be ignored. We were about to turn around the whole moral and cultural decline of our country. Our man was in the White House. The Senate was under our control. The media wanted our opinion on every issue. After the election in 80, Falwell was booked solid for interviews, speeches, and Ed Dobson was as well, because Falwell couldn't do them all. He was going all over the country and being asked by reporters and on TV shows and radio interviews constantly. And they said, we succeeded, right? We won the election in 1980. It's going to get fixed. We got our guy. But a man working that knew Ed Dobson, a man named Harold Wilmington, said, you're casting your pearls before swine. You're a preacher and a pastor, and you're wasting your time and your gifts doing television shows and pursuing politics. He didn't walk away from it then, but that conversation with Wilmington, he admits in Blinded by Might, put the seed of doubt in Ed Dobson's heart. And yes, he did walk away from the Moral Majority, left it at the height of its success in order to go back to the pastorate. Ended up at the church in Grand Rapids that I've been to, where he did tremendous work. But what did Jerry Falwell say when Dobson asked him about it? When he started to have his own doubts, he said, well, let me go talk to Jerry. He said, I came to the point in my ministry when I realized I had to do certain things for the greater good of the country. This is my job. I'm an ordained minister. That is a fascinating thing for Jerry Falwell to say. I had to start doing things for the greater good. Many of us, anytime someone says the greater good, we go, what are you doing? Right? Because that's a scary term. We're not sure what you're getting at when you start talking about the greater good. But that's what Jerry said. He walked away from his work with his church and the university in order to do this. And he said, this is a more important task. He was convinced of it. And of course, you see the button. That's part of the backlash, that the Moral Majority is neither. Those were people that didn't appreciate either of those sentiments, either of those descriptors. Dobson says what started as a legitimate and rational response to the threat of theological liberalism evolved into a political agenda motivated more by fear than conviction. And he tells the story in Blinded by Might that their mailings, the things that they sent out about upcoming elections, became more and more negative. Started painting the opposition in more and more unflattering terms.
And that started to eat at him. And he asked them, why are we doing this? And the answer was simply, that's what people pay attention to. People send money in when you scare them. And you know that's true. Because we're a generation later, and that is everywhere. How many of the mailings that you got before last November were happy? Was it 90% that the other side have puppets for demons, some variation of that? 10% of them were about what our candidate, our party is going to do, but almost all of them, almost every commercial, almost every pamphlet, almost every whatever was bad. They're bad, they're bad, they're bad. They're coming for you, they're going to get you, they're horrible, they're evil. And both sides saying it. And the third party saying, we're here too. Crickets, nobody knows you're here, sorry. But that was the trend that he saw coming and said, what are we doing? Dobson's conclusion. Did the moral majority really make a difference? During the height of the moral majority, we were taking in millions of dollars a year. It was a big organization. We published a magazine. We organized state chapters. We lobbied Congress. We aired a radio program and more. They were doing a ton of stuff. So did it work? Is the moral condition, and he wrote this in the 90s, is the moral condition of America better because of our efforts? Even a casual observation of the current moral culture suggests that despite all the time, money, and energy, despite all the political power, we failed. Things have not gotten better, they've gotten worse. And I don't know if you think things are better or worse than they were in the 80s or the 90s or the zeros, but they're not significantly better. I don't think anybody says the American culture is significantly better than it was when I was a kid, whenever that time was for you. Have I ever heard anyone say that? I remember the bad old days, and I'm glad we're in the good days now. Is anybody saying that? Despite the work of the moral majority and the Christian coalition and et cetera, et cetera. What's been changed? Am I cheering you up yet? All right.
Still waiting.
Well, you know, that whole thing about a spoonful of sugar helps medicine to go down, that's malarkey. Just take it. Now I'm going to get Mary Poppins stuck in my head, darn it. And do that on purpose. So what lesson did Ed learn from this? And with this we'll take a pause. We must be cautious in the statements we make regarding religion and politics. And by we, he's talking about ministers in particular. We must also exercise caution with regard to those with whom we disagree. When preachers start talking about politics, it becomes tempting to label our opponents as the devil and their views as anti-Christian. It's really tempting, and I can show you so many examples. In some cases, our political opponents will even be fellow believers who need to be respected as such. Now, of course, many of the people involved in politicizing the church wouldn't grant him that. They would say if they disagree with me, they're clearly not Christians. They've crossed that Rubicon a long time ago. But notice how he ends. We're also quick to believe that God is on our side. Who used to say God wills it, God's on our side? That we tend to see our political opponents as God-hating, Christ-denying hypocrites. Isn't that what's being fed over the airwaves, the radio waves, the TV waves, the YouTube videos? That they hate God. I don't need to tell you who's saying it, just because they're all saying they hate God, they're evil, they're trying to destroy the country, whatever. I put a picture of his book on there. That's Ed during his year of living like Jesus. After his diagnosis with ALS, he had to retire from Calvary Undenam in Grand Rapids, Michigan, because he couldn't do the job anymore. And he spent a year living as a Messianic Jew, following all of the laws of the Old Covenant, kosher and the Sabbath and all of that, let his hair grow. And it's a fascinating book. It's not on this topic per se, but I couldn't pass up the chance to recommend it to you because he had some powerful insights
He read one of the Gospels every day. Matthew on Monday, Luke on Tuesday, and then just kept going. The day he had to read John took a while because it's a slow read and a long one. But he did that for a whole year and towards the end when he was fighting ALS. So let's pause for a minute. Many of you remember the election in 1980 firsthand. You remember what we're talking about here. I didn't say you remember Prohibition firsthand. I was polite. I don't really remember the election in 1980. I won't tell you how old I was, but not much. Questions? Thoughts? We've got some more pieces of the puzzle to look at on the home stretch here, but
what was the name of the book again?
The Year of Living Like Jesus by Ed Dobson. If you put Ed Dobson in Google or whatever, it'll pop up. And that you can't miss that face with the salt and pepper beard. It's a fascinating book. Kathy read it. You liked it. So there's a Yelp review or whatever. But one person there that you can trust besides me. So what about the marriage of church and state? Can it work? What does history tell us about that cozy relationship and how well it does or doesn't work? Well, one of the examples we see from history is what happened with Byzantium, which is the Eastern Orthodox Church, the eastern half of the empire, or Tsarist Russia, because they're basically more or less the same idea. And in both cases, the emperor, or the czar, it means the same thing, basically said, I am the boss, and you are underneath me. And it was a top-down organization. So emperor, church, like that. And so the office of the patriarch, whether it was the Russian patriarch or in Constantinople, became a political tool. The emperor could get rid of you if he didn't like you. And he could reward it, and he could put his cousin in there, something like that, in order to make sure things went smoothly. But of course, that's not how the church is supposed to pick its leaders. Right? The Apostle Paul didn't write Timothy and say, as long as you're the nephew of the king, you're qualified to be a bishop. Right? Remember that? It's not there. But unfortunately, the situation in the West is actually not much better on that same issue, because they fought for a long time. Like the King of France would say, my cousin needs to be the next bishop of Tours. And the Pope would say, no, he's not. I've nominated the next bishop. And they went to war over it, and they fought about it and excommunicated people, and it became a real mess. It's called the investiture controversy. It's a real winner. But there, in that model, the church is under the government. The church is an instrument of the state. Like the police or the IRS or whatever, the church is kind of like a department of the state. That was one model, based largely on an autocratic system where you have an emperor or a king. Something very different is Calvin's Geneva. During the Reformation, the Reform movement came to Geneva. John Calvin came in and sort of helped set things up. And there, the church was seen as an equal partner. In 1541, Calvin shows up and remodels the Swiss government and the government of the church in Geneva into his own liking. If you're interested in that, he instituted 4 offices: pastors to preach, administers and administer the sacraments, doctors is what they called them, to instruct people in the faith, elders to provide discipline, interesting, and deacons to care for the poor and the needy. He said, okay, this is our role. These are the people that are going to do it, and they set it up that way. They didn't try to get themselves involved necessarily in government affairs. They had an understanding. This is our stuff. This is your stuff. However, it was not free of issues. A man named Michael Servetus. He was an exile from Spain. He had fled Spain because the Inquisition had condemned him to death. His crime was saying that the Trinity is not found in the Bible. The word Trinity is not, FYI. You know that. The word Trinity is the word we use to describe what we believe the Bible teaches. John Calvin said, well, hey, the government needs to protect the church. The man's a heretic. He needs to die. And they burned him at the stake. Now, this marriage lasted as long as the church and state were in agreement. And one of the reasons that it worked for a while in Geneva is that there was tremendous homogeneity, right? One ethnic group there, one culture, one denomination almost exclusively. That's, again, monasticism is an interesting idea, but it's not going to work writ large. Well, the hand and glove work of the City Council of Geneva and the Church of Geneva isn't going to work in the United States of America, right? Because who gets to be in charge? What's the official version that gets to have the marriage? Is it Lutheran, Methodist, Catholic, Presbyterian? Which one, right? And oh, by the way, there are people that are not involved. They didn't have that issue in Geneva. Everybody was part of the church. Because you were a citizen of Geneva, you were automatically in the church. It really wasn't up to you. That's one way to do it. But again, it only works in a scenario and where you've got everybody on board. I told you we'd talk about Oliver Cromwell, and I know you've been itching to hear about Cromwell. How did that happen? Well, King Charles I of England dissolves the Parliament in 1629. Probably not a good idea for a king to say, I don't need Parliament. And he basically said, I'm the king, God made me the king, everybody sit down and shut up. Long story short, he attempted, and this is something that might blow your mind, to impose on the Scottish Presbyterian Church the English Book of Common Prayer, the English Prayer Book. And they had 2 rebellions about it. Thinking your church, maybe people don't appreciate you switch hymnals or something. They rose up and got their pitchforks and said, we're going to war because of the prayer book. That's different. He also continued to fight against Parliament, and civil war ensued. And one of the things that they were arguing about was the church in England. Is it a Presbyterian structure? Or is it going to be a loose confederation? There was a military coup in 1648. Charles was executed. And the independents, the people that wanted a loose confederation, were in control. But they don't have a king anymore. How do you run a country in the 17th century without a king? Well, we have what's known as the interregnum. 1649 to 1660, England, for a little while, was a republic. Did you know that? A little while, not long. Oliver Cromwell was the general, and nobody could stand up to him on the battlefield. So that's why he was in charge, because every time someone tried to stop him, they whooped him. But his government, his entire government, was dependent upon the army. The Irish weren't happy. The Scots weren't happy. I got a little of some of that in me, so I get it. And Parliament wasn't happy. And so he called himself the Lord Protector of the Realm. And here's my army they're protecting. It was fascinating. He was committed. He was against the Presbyterians. If you're a Presbyterian, my apologies for Oliver Cromwell. He crushed them in Parliament, and he established his version of Protestantism as the religion of England. And you're saying, wait a minute, that's not the way England's run today as a church. That's not the primary church. What happened? Well, Cromwell died, as men do, and Charles II was restored to the throne and undid everything that Cromwell had done to reform the church, and nobody said boo. That's the fascinating thing. They went to war, wanted to go to war twice over the prayer book, but when they undid everything that Cromwell did, most people were like, yeah, it's okay. Why? Well, Cromwell's government had closed theaters, taken down maypoles, and ordered shopkeepers to stay open on the superstitious feast of Christmas Day. You see the parallel to Prohibition. They tried to take away all the fun. And Cromwell's government, that could not be beaten on the field of battle, the people didn't like it. They were disliked. So with the restoration of the Church of England to its previous stance, Presbyterians now found themselves alongside Independents and the Baptists, together with the Quakers, whom they all despised. Just to let you know, they were all on the outside looking in. Which leads to this conclusion: religious positions gained at the point of a sword will evaporate once the sword is withdrawn. The attainment of power is not an end to itself. Cromwell had the pinnacle of power. Nobody could stop him. But he didn't have anything to do with it. What do I do with it? How do we use it? And so they did a whole bunch of stuff. And then when that power went away, all that stuff was undone. Like it never happened. And the people that were on his side thinking, yay, we're winning, now see themselves saying, uh-oh. Right? The tide of battle. Because they weren't winning hearts and minds, as we remember from Vietnam. They were just winning battles. And so the war didn't actually accomplish anything. Well, what about these guys? Oh, man, going to ruin the Pilgrims too? The Pilgrims at Plymouth Colony. The beast is us. Somebody tell me where I stole that from. No. Close. Not Lord of the Rings, but Lord of the Flies. William Golding's The Lord of the Flies because I see a strong parallel as this story unfolds. Because they brought their problems with them. In 1620, the English separatists, the ones that from before, right? They established a colony hoping to isolate themselves completely from the corruptions they attributed to the Church of England. They said, that thing's gone, we're out of here, we're going by ourselves. Fascinatingly, for all their piety, they didn't have a single clergyman for 9 years in Plymouth Colony. Didn't have one. So they didn't even have the Eucharist. They didn't have the sacraments for 9 years. Some people are scratching their heads at that. You didn't know that about the Pilgrims. The form assumed by the Church of Massachusetts was therefore the paradox of an established Reformed church with an all-embracing system of parishes like England, but run by local assemblies of self-selected godly, a form of church government which was known as congregational. Yay! This is a congregational church. We're Baptists. So I'm all for congregational governance in ecclesiology. You're with me so far? Unfortunately, the story gets worse from here. So it's not a theocracy. It's not a state run by the church, but it's much like Geneva. The government and the church are partners. We're on the same team, the same people, right? The church meeting and the city council meeting might as well be the same meeting because it's all the same group of people. In 1631, the franchise for the colony's assembly, the ability to vote, was limited to church members. That was an interesting step. You can't have a say in local government if you're not a member of the church. But of course, it was compulsory for everyone to go to church. And the government tried to keep people from moving far enough away from a church building that they couldn't get to church on time on Sunday. I'm not sure how they figured it out. How far can you go on Sunday morning to get there on time? How many miles? But they said, you can't build a house out there in the boonies by yourself because you won't be able to get to church. 1636, Roger Williams, you know him, flees the colony to Rhode Island. He did not get along well with the leadership. They wanted to arrest him. Rhode Island soon became a haven for an intimidating variety of the discontented. I love that phrase. An intimidating variety of the discontented. Basically, like Robin Hood and Sherwood Forest. Everybody that was not happy in Plymouth ended up with Williams. And he did something radical in the 17th century. He embraced complete religious toleration, and for the 17th century, this is huge, even including Jews and Turks. He means Muslims. The Ottoman Turks were the primary Muslims that most Christians knew at that point. He said, anybody, pick what you want, I'm fine. In 1647, a number of towns in Rhode Island proclaimed that all men may walk as their consciences persuade them, every one in the name of his God. Radical at the time. Throughout the 30 Years' War, throughout the Reformation, nobody was arguing for freedom of conscience. Not really. They were all arguing for doing it our way. Everybody's going to get on board with us, kind of thing. Williams was against that. In 1657, Quakers arrived in Massachusetts, and there they were publicly flogged, had their ears cropped, and 4 of them were hanged for missionary activity. Did you know that? Did you know that the Pilgrims hanged 4 Quakers? They were despised for 2 reasons. Number one, they allowed women to preach. And secondly, they really just wanted to get away from secular life. They didn't want to be involved. They wanted to be left alone, and they didn't let them be left alone, which is a bit of an irony, is it not? Why did we come to Plymouth Colony? To get away from that overbearing Church of England that you don't like? And when the Quakers come here looking for the same thing, you say, no, 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 that was for us, not for you. Freedom for us, not for you. And then it ends in a way that is unpleasant with the Salem witch trials, where you have more than 200 people accused of witchcraft, 30 of them found guilty, 19 executed, and at least 5 more that died while awaiting trial in jail because of the conditions. Historian George Lincoln Burr said the Salem witchcraft was the rock on which theocracy shattered, because they made themselves look like fools, right? The rest of the colonies looked at that and said, what are you, witches? Seriously? There's not a bunch of witches everywhere, are there? If you saw Vision and Wanda, you might revisit that, because the MCU made that seem real, but that's okay. That's pop culture. It's not actually real. None of you watched it, so none of you got my reference. That's okay. I'm on an island by myself. That's fine. Me and Ralph and Piggy. Some of you might have gotten that one. So where are we at? We've had a few small examples of some people that kind of sort of made it work. The monastic movement, we had to withdraw a little bit and put some real strict things on people in order to set that aside. Geneva, we could do it for a little while as long as everybody was on board. And even there, we had to resort to burning someone at the stake. But most of these examples, when the church embraces power, it screws it up, makes it worse, does things in the name of God that God never asked us to do. Noble hopes, noble dreams, noble visions, noble goals, evil, ignoble, dishonorable means to achieve them. It doesn't fit. It doesn't work. Didn't work then. Next week, we will bring this up to the home stretch and talk about what this myth that any nation can be a Christian nation is really costing the church. What's the price to be paid for this? And we'll talk about some examples. And of course, everybody will be in agreement and nobody will be offended by any of it, so it'll be great. But I think it needs saying. So, and of course, so did Ed Dobson and Pastor Boyd and others as well. I'm just scratching the surface. There's a lot of other books on this topic, but those were and of course, those were both written more than 20 years ago. Thoughts, comments, closing ideas. This one I told you was the short one. We're 10 minutes ahead of schedule. Other examples from history that you think fit the pattern or don't fit the pattern or that you want to bring into it. There are others. There were lots of others. Could have talked about how the Catholic Church in Central and South America forced the Indians to convert and forced people into slavery, about how they tried to get to impose Christianity on people that they brought from Africa as slaves, while of course denying them the right to learn how to read and raping the women. I mean, there's just all sorts of examples where that are a massive head scratcher for how people thought that this was the right way for the church to be. Yes?
You said that nobody can make an argument that morality has gotten better. The ecumenical movement.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely.
And at times it was very unpleasant. Also, the civil rights movement.
Oh, sure.
Still has a ways to go, but it's come a long way.
There are a couple of encouraging signs.
I grew up in Oil City.
Yep.
And I walked in tell the truth. Tell the truth. Chivalry, right? Yeah. And I walked in the restroom as a gay student was beaten to a bloody pulp. And there seems to be more humanity towards that segment of the population at large. church with hospital,
Yep.
university.
Yep.
Uh,
Let me clarify that.
and apartheid in South
Yep.
Africa.
Let me clarify that I very rarely hear anyone make the argument that morality in Western culture is getting better.
I don't think the moral majority had anything to do with it.
Well, and so the question certainly, there is no marked difference. Some things have gotten a little better, as in civil rights. Some things have gotten a little worse, as in the rampant drug, like the opioid pandemic, or the sexual exploitation of children because of the internet. Some stuff has gotten a little bit better. Some stuff has gotten a little bit worse. But we've not gotten back to a golden age.
Right.
We've not solved the problems at the ballot box. Certainly, in any of the problems. If the problems the Democrats point out, the problems the Republicans point out, neither of them have been solved in this era of politicizing the church in either direction. And I think that's part of the issue. And absolutely, the civil rights movement is one of the few counterexamples. But notice that the vast majority of that work was nonviolent resistance. What really changed hearts and minds in the civil rights movement? The videos of nonviolent people being beaten savagely with fire hoses and batons and police dogs. That changed hearts and minds in a way that no other thing did. Just like the videos night after night after night of American boys being put in body bags in Vietnam changed the opinion against that war. But yes, that was one time that they tried.
Mustard seed ministry has helped.
Oh, absolutely. I'm very proud of some of that work we're doing. But again, that's the slow, incremental, person-by-person work, which is, of course, what the civil rights movement, right? While Martin Luther King Jr. and others were saying nonviolent resistance, the Black Panthers were saying, let's get guns because this is not going to work. Right? And much as Nat Turner had a generation before the Civil War, much as John Brown did by raiding Harper's Ferry. So there are some.
Mothers Against Drunk Driving.
Sure.
Has had a big impact.
It has. Mothers Against Drunk Driving has had a big impact, but I think that the consensus is that DARE was kind of a flop. The DARE program was everywhere in the schools. I grew up with the DARE T-shirts and all that stuff, and that hadn't fixed that problem. And again, so when the church has tried the hard road, like it did against apartheid in South Africa, like it did in the civil rights movement here, there has been some success. But most of the time, people have said, well, forget that. Because that's slower, harder, more self-sacrificial, right? Which is the easier choice, to stand arm in arm with a march of people that are going to get the crap beat out of them, or to pull the lever on a vote, or to send some money to somebody. I mean, it's a lot easier to be on the sidelines. And again, that might not have worked. Right? The civil rights movement could have been crushed had the government chose to do so, much like the Soviets sent tanks into Hungary, or Tiananmen Square, or the death of Christianity in Japan, when they basically just murdered all the Christians and said, well, that's the end of that. But the way that would have unfolded would have glorified God. Would have been rebounded to God's glory, would have been used by the will of God in order to spread the gospel. Christians giving up their lives and in self-sacrifice, serving like Mother Teresa in the slums of Calcutta, that inspires the gospel. No matter whether it wins or loses, whether it succeeds or fails, it inspires people about the gospel. Christians holding up their sign with all the things that God hates, all of the anger and the denouncements, that pushes people away from the gospel. So, and we'll get to that next week. We're going to dive into that next week. It's not about whether we win or lose, it's how we play the game.
I agree with all
Oh, great.
But what I don't agree with is there has been some progress in morality through the kingdom of God.
Oh, sure. But most of that is not part of our political discourse right now, and that's the point. So I wish it was, and I wish that was the conversation we were having most of the time. Is how can we do more things like the civil rights movement? How can we do more things, neighborhood by neighborhood, family by family, to transform things? But by and large, I don't hear that. And I don't mean in any one particular person I'm talking to, but just the conversation, the online conversation, the publications, the radio shows. Most of that's not the direction they're going in. So, all right, we'll wrap it up. Was there another comment, MJ?
I was just going to say, maybe it's my age or the church I was in at the time. I don't remember the church that I was in being a part of the whole civil rights movement. In fact, I see it as being more of a downer towards the civil rights movement and saying,
sure.
Leave that alone. That's
and that's faded. That realization has faded over time. Is that movement was very controversial, even within the black church. In some cases, it was controversial, but it was definitely controversial in the white church in America. What they were doing, and the ministers that went and joined them, whether they were Catholic priests or otherwise, they got some pushback. We look back on that and think, well, we won one. That was a good one. But at the time, like I said, it could have gone either way. They could have just ended up as martyrs, and the story could have gone on in the way it was going. So anyway, thank you. We will pick it up next week with part 3 and bring it home. Appreciate you coming.
No, sorry.
Am I in the right